Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 932. My opponent started off with d4 and I went knight f6, goes c4. So I play e6, ready to play my normal, my favorite Nimzo Indian. He goes g3. You can see g3 is the third choice here, and this makes this Catalan position. The normal way to get to the Catalan, however, is to play knight f3 first. First knight f3, then g3. And if black replies with pawn to d pawn to d5 after knight f3, that's the normal response there. That's a standard Catalan position. So the early g3 gives me a little more flexibility for how I could play. I could go with d5 immediately, and we maybe, if he played knight f3, transpose into a standard Catalan. But there are other ideas here, and I played bishop b4 check. You can see that's the second choice. This is often a way to play against the Catalan. And then white usually blocks with the bishop, and then this bishop retreats. It's a funny little dance of the pieces, but the idea is the bishop here blocks the queen's view of the center, and maybe it'll require another move to develop properly. So you're trying to hamper white's development a little bit with that move. But instead he played knight c3. And so after knight c3, this position resembles Nimzo Indian here. Let's see, I played d5. I did look at a couple of these lines, during my analysis. So c5, the top choice, is this is a position that would be Gary Kasparov used to play the Nimzo Indian this way. As white against the Nimzo Indian, he'd play with the two knights out, and then he'd play with g3. So this is kind of a line of the Nimzo we could have gotten into. Or if I had just castled here, that's apparently good as well. So all these lines are fine. Yeah, so this would go into more Catalan-like lines if I go with d5. So anyway, but it's kind of similar to what happened in the game. I just went with d5 immediately. Also a fine move. And then here he went e3. So at this point, we're actually out of the opening book altogether. You could still transpose into one of those Catalan or Nimzo Indian lines with moves like knight f3 or bishop g2. But he went e3, and now we're just on our own. So let's look at this from the notation tab. I went ahead and castled here. I went bishop g2. And I went ahead and took. That's often the response after the bishop has moved. Sometimes even before, kind of put the question to that bishop, does it want to go this way or does it want to go this way? But waiting till after it moves and then taking the pawn is, I think this is good for black. The chess engine is actually starting to give black an advantage here. The thing is, if you look at the development, it's about even. It's white's turn to move, and white will develop a piece. So white will have 3 pieces out. I've got 2 pieces, plus I've castled. So as far as that goes, it's even, but white will also have to take a move to round up this pawn at some point. So I think that gives black a slight edge here. Anyway, he went knight e2, and it went c6. So c6 is not the strongest move in this position. e5, well, first of all, c5, just getting there. I play c5 later. But for the moment, I was thinking of just putting up a strong barrier to this bishop, which can become quite a good piece. But even stronger than c5. But c5 could have been played, and it would have been better than c6. I end up playing c5 later, so it's kind of a waste of a tempo to play c6 here. But even stronger is e5. And this is kind of a cool move. If he takes, then you trade queens and put the knight on g4. So that rounds up the pawn because you've got a threat on f2 with a fork. So if white defends the fork, you take here. And now you've just got better pieces, and you still have pawn up, right? There's still an extra pawn here for black, and the pieces are all active. This bishop is getting into the game very quickly, and so is the knight. So whereas white's king is in the center, and in the way it's preventing his rooks from connecting, his bishop looks kind of sad here, trapped behind his own pawns. So that's just a strong positional edge to black here. And I guess there's an immediate threat with this check. Well, maybe it's not such a big threat, but maybe it's a little inconvenient. Anyway, I just played c6 here. So we get into a position which is more or less even, whereas I could have had a bigger advantage in those other lines. Let's see, he went, oh no, I went knight bd7, yeah, get my pieces out. He went a3, kicking the bishop. Just dropped back to e7. Wasn't sure at this point it was such a great idea to trade for the knight. He played queen a4. And, I wasn't particularly worried about holding that onto that pawn, but I don't want to give it away too easily. I was thinking it might be nice to get a piece in the center like this. The chess engine likes b5 better. That holds onto the pawn solidly. And, it does weaken this diagonal, but apparently queen b6 is adequate to defend the c-pawn for the moment. Maybe bishop to b7 will be played later, and the rook will come into the game. Yeah, looks like a good position for black, still a pawn up. Anyway, I went knight b6 here. He went queen c2. So defended the pawn, hit the queen. And then I went ahead with this c5 break to give a little more space to my pieces. Let's see, he didn't take right away, but played rook d1. I think that's an interesting move. I went queen e8 after some thought. I wasn't quite expecting that move, and I had to decide what to do. The chess engine says that's okay. It says I could also have played queen c7, but I have to be willing to play queen b8. But I guess eventually I will kick this knight back and be able to get out of the box there. They seem to be about more or less about the same, and the game is still about even around here. So he went with knight e4, and maybe that's a slight mistake. I have a way to get an advantage here, and I start out okay. I take, oh yeah, so what should he play instead of knight e4? Just developing with the bishop, or maybe pushing the a-pawn forward. There's a couple ideas for black in this position. So moving the knight twice, it runs into a little bit of trouble here. And as I was starting to say, I play this correctly at first. I take a pawn, and he takes back with the knight. Then I take off his knight. Takes back with the bishop. Then I play bishop f6, so that's when I give that advantage away. The right follow-up here is f5. The bishop goes back, and then bishop d7. This is kind of a clever way to get the bishop out when I don't have to worry so much about the bishop coming here, because I also have bishop to a4 with this skewer. Now I also have to worry at some point about the e-pawn that his knight is hitting. So I mean, there's a lot going on, but it turns out that bishop d7 can be played here, and it's there's not really time for white to grab the pawn on b7. So it's kind of a nice way to unwind from my position, and after some other move, perhaps I could bring the knight into the center. Anyway, this position is an advantage to black, at least according to the chess engine. So this move, after bishop f6, white has the edge by grabbing the pawn here, although the material is even. But the thing is, my king side is weakened, and with good play, white should have an edge here. So dropping the bishop back is good. It needs to retreat before it gets trapped here. So he drops back. I play e5, kicking the knight. And although the chess engine gives white an edge, it's only a slight edge, so it's not like a full pawn or something. Even it's like half a pawn advantage to white, kind of like an opening advantage. Anyway, he went queen e2 here, a little bit of maneuvering. I played g6. I mean, he was threatening with the queen to come out directly to the h5 square, and that was pretty dangerous, but g6 was an adequate response. So he tries to maneuver his knight around, get that into the game. Oh, plus it was hanging. It was hanging the whole time, so he had to move that eventually. And I went with bishop g4, pinning the knight. He went queen c2, unpinning. Actually not approved by the chess engine. Again, developing the bishop is the right idea here. Just get your pieces out. Anyway, he went queen c2. Went rook d8. And instead of rook d8, actually, there's a nice idea here the chess engine came up with, queen to a4. So this is, well, the rook is loose back there. He could just move the queen away, but there's some interesting stuff going on here. The bishop, if it comes here to b7 to take this pawn, let's see, the queen is hanging, so he can't do that first. So he trades queens, and I take back with the knight, and then he plays bishop b7. Then the knight can come into the c. First I chase the bishop away with the rook, and then the knight comes into the c5 square. So erase some of those arrows. So imagine a knight on c5. It's taking away squares from the bishop, and in the meantime, this knight is somewhat pinned here. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a complicated position, but queen a4 will lead to some kind of edge for black. Anyway, I played rook d8, which allows simplification. He could just trade rooks here, but now he chose to develop his bishop. And let's see, I bring my queen out to b5. He plays bishop to c3. Yeah, putting pressure on this pawn. And here's another point where I make a mistake. So my first mistake was at bishop f6, allowing him to take on h7. This is a second mistake. I wasn't appreciating that I still had a pin on the knight. You know, there's a rook back here, and he probably doesn't want to lose the exchange. So I didn't really have to worry about the e-pawn. So my bishop takes f3 was an overreaction at this point. I could, for example, just play knight a4. And after bishop takes e5, I could just take the bishop. And if he takes that, I take the rook. So that all works out well for me. And if he can't take the pawn, then he's got to reposition his bishop a little bit. That'll take the pressure off my center. You know, I could put a rook to the e file too, or maybe trade first and play rook e8. So anyway, edge to black after that. After bishop takes f3, I think we're in the range of about even, or slight edge to white again. So back and forth. Let's see. After taking, I continued with knight to d5. Wanted to activate my knight. He decided to trade it off. And after these exchanges, I was feeling pretty good with my advanced queen here. Let's see, the material is even. White has pretty good activity, though, in contrast to earlier in the game where I had the better development and the more active pieces. Now white gets into the game and all his pieces are playing now. So and his pawn structure is a little more sound. So actually in this position there's an edge to white. So anyway, I drop my queen back to e6. He goes queen e4. He's going to pile up on my somewhat separated e-pawn. This has to be defended with pieces, so it amounts to a weakness. Let's see, I played b6 here so I didn't have to always worry about the b-pawn. Played rook d5, piling up, and I just defend for the moment. He plays f4, and there's just no way for me to hold the pawn. So I played king g7 first. I wanted to get away from checks on the back rank or on the side. And then after he takes the pawn, I drop the bishop back. I didn't want to move the bishop away first because that would give him more options on how to take the pawn. In particular, he could take with the rook if I move the bishop away, and that would force my queen to move. So here, by allowing him to take first with the pawn, I give him the extra pawn, but it's a isolated pawn, and I can get pressure on it. So it's not like he has a complete advantage here, but he does pick up another pawn, and so I played bishop to c5 here, pinning his e-pawn. And his queen is actually a bit overloaded here. The queen went to e4, but I can just take that pawn because the queen can't take back and still defend the rook. So I'm exploiting that to get my pawn back. He went king g2, dropped my bishop back to c5. He went to b4, kicking my bishop, and went back to e7, trying to keep control of this square. And then he went queen d4. So he's lining up for this attack along the diagonal, but I wasn't too worried at this point. I thought this pawn was securely blockaded, and I have control of this square with my bishop. So I just played rook to c8, and I'm setting up another threat here. Actually, there's the threat of rook takes bishop, because after queen takes, then I have queen takes rook with check. So So I'd be just up a piece in that position, and that would be winning. But he can play bishop d2. And now this position is about even. So white is a pawn up, but I've stopped it, and it's, I guess, hard for white to make any progress, and I can penetrate with my rook into white's camp. So I've managed to struggle in this game and get back to even after a couple of mistakes. But here he blunders. He plays rook to d6, which I didn't get at first because I can just take it. But then I realized, he's playing to open up this diagonal, which looks fatal. And it almost is. There's only one move here, but all you need, as they say, all you need is one move. So he took, and I played f6. And then there's really nothing for white in this position. But the interesting thing is there is no other defense. Any move by the king, I was just planning to walk away with the king at first, but he just places the queen there, and the pawn is blocking my escape route. So I had to wait and figure it out. Couldn't play that bishop takes rook move until I was sure I had a way to escape. But then eventually I realized that f6 was sufficient to stop the attack, and pushing the pawn forward doesn't do anything. Now it's on a light square and can't be defended, so I can always round that up. And if we back up to the final position here, if he plays some other move, the problem is there's no way he can get his bishop around. No, that's not entirely true. He could play here. I could play here, and then he could defend like this. Okay, so he could defend that pawn. I didn't spot that idea, but anyway, in this position, the chess engine gives black a winning advantage. I guess after this sequence, b5, rook d8. Yeah, instead of rook d8, maybe I would keep the rook on this file and try and go after his king. I don't know. Yeah, it's still a bit tricky. Hard to see how I might make progress from this position, but in any case, I have the material edge of the rook versus the bishop, and I would have to find some way of getting active. Maybe bringing the queen in and doubling on the e file is a way to continue here, since I can bring the queen in with check. Anyway, interesting game. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you again soon. Bye.